In 2016, I was driving cross-country to visit my parents who had just moved to the West Coast. During my second night of driving through mostly empty highway with scattered gas stations, my old and unreliable car's check engine light came on. Although I wasn't surprised given the car's condition, I didn't know much about cars and had no idea what was wrong. I looked up the nearest gas station, which was 30 miles away, but before I could reach it, my engine suddenly died, leaving me coasting to a stop on the roadside. After trying everything I could think of to restart it and even checking under the hood, I realized I needed help. When I pulled out my phone, I discovered I had no service, making calls impossible. After 30 minutes of failed attempts to find a solution, I decided to hitchhike for the first time in my life, feeling nervous and uncertain about what to expect. I stood by the roadside for hours, watching single cars pass every 15 minutes or so without stopping. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. when I finally saw headlights approaching. To my surprise, the black pickup truck actually pulled over. The driver was a very thin man with a long, narrow face and long black hair that made me feel uneasy. He cheerfully asked if I needed a lift with a big grin that somehow put me off, but I was exhausted and this might be my only chance, so I got in the back seat. I tried making small talk, asking what he was doing out so late, and he responded that he was just cruising the highway like it was a hobby, which seemed strange given we were in the middle of nowhere. He didn't ask why I needed a ride, which I found odd. Then he looked at me in the mirror and asked if I had any weapons, saying he was just making sure he was safe, all while wearing that same unsettling smile. I said no and stopped talking after that strange question. After 10 more minutes of silent driving, he suddenly turned off the highway onto a dirt road. I immediately sat up, realizing something was wrong, and asked where we were going. He glanced at me but didn't answer, so I asked again more loudly as fear built up inside me. I decided that no matter what, I would run the next time the car stopped, so I prepared with my hand on the door handle. We drove down the rough dirt road until a small, decaying farmhouse appeared in the dim light with its front door wide open and the whole structure looking like it was falling apart. When he suddenly slammed on the brakes, I jolted forward and he immediately jumped out and ran around to my side of the car. I swung my door open and sprinted toward the tree line with him chasing behind me. Once we were in the dark woods, I could only hear his footsteps about 10 to 15 feet behind me. I took a sharp turn, hid behind a tree, and held my breath as his footsteps passed by and continued deeper into the woods. For a full minute, I heard his creepy voice calling out repeatedly in the same disturbing tone, saying things like, "Come on, let's go back, I'll give you a ride, I wasn't trying to scare you." What made it worse was that I never heard his footsteps return to the car, so I had no idea where he was or if he was lurking nearby in the darkness. I knew I had to leave, so I quietly walked in what I thought was the direction of the main road. Once I was deeper in the woods, I pulled out my phone and turned the brightness low, discovering I somehow had service now. I almost cried from relief as I dialed 911 and had them track my location. I managed to make it back to the main road where I met 2 police officers, but by then the man and his car had somehow disappeared. The farmhouse turned out to be just an old abandoned place, which made it even stranger that the man knew exactly where it was and had turned into it deliberately. I have no idea what he planned to do, and I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. I was working a quick DoorDash shift on a Monday night after getting off my day job at 7 p.m., deciding to make a few deliveries. It was a typical quiet night, and I had delivered about 7 or 8 orders before taking what would be my last delivery of the evening. After dropping off the food at a house, I started heading back to town where my apartment was located. It was around 10 p.m., and the delivery had taken me about 20 minutes out into the farmland that surrounds our town. A couple of minutes into my drive back, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down and the man moved over slightly, but not enough to be completely out of my way. When I got closer, he looked directly at me and stuck his thumb out. In my headlights, I could see he was an older guy, probably in his early 50s, with a large backpack over his shoulders. Since I was already slowing down, I figured I'd be helpful and ask if he needed a ride into the city since I was heading that way anyway. He leaned on my window and thanked me for stopping. His eyes looked heavy and exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, but he seemed nice enough, so I agreed to give him a ride. What I wasn't expecting was for him to immediately open the passenger door and sit right next to me instead of getting in the back seat, which I thought was more common courtesy. As he got settled, I looked past him toward where he had come from, which was just a field of tall grass, like a huge farm or something. I asked him if he was from around here and what brought him out to the farmlands. He told me he was just making his way across the country to visit his family and didn't have a car, so he'd been hitchhiking rides. I thought that was interesting and asked more about where he was from, but he gave very vague and uninterested answers. A couple of times I caught him looking into my back seat, not just quick glances but like he was carefully examining the whole back seat and searching for something. Something about this guy started to make me feel uncomfortable because he wasn't talking much and was acting really unusual. I asked if everything was okay, keeping my eyes on the road, but he didn't respond. When I looked over at him, my eyes were drawn to his disturbing stare before I noticed the knife he was clenching in his right hand. He told me to stop the car, so I didn't say a word and parked right in the middle of the road. I was terrified and thought that if I let him take whatever he wanted, I'd get out unharmed, so that's exactly what I planned to do. As soon as the car was in park, I turned to open my door, but he quickly stopped me and demanded I get in the back, still clenching the knife. I froze for a moment, realizing we were in the middle of empty fields and that if I got in the back, I'd probably never have another chance to escape. That's when I also noticed his large backpack was slightly open by his feet, revealing a thick bundle of rope inside. I had no choice but to try escaping now before it was too late. I opened the door and jumped out of the car in one swift motion while the man tried jumping across the front seat to grab me, but I sprinted to the other side of the road and into the tall grass. I kept running through the field until I felt like he couldn't find me, then I stood still and waited. He yelled a few times from the road, but then it went quiet, and all I could hear was the wind blowing the grass around. I remained still and motionless for a good 15 minutes before slowly making my way back toward the road. Looking through the grass, I could see my headlights still beaming onto the pavement with the driver's door still open, but the man was nowhere to be seen. After watching for another minute, I sprinted up, grabbed my phone, then ran back into the grass and called 911. I didn't know if he was still hiding somewhere waiting for me, so I didn't risk staying up there. Eventually the police showed up, and I couldn't believe the man didn't drive away in my car. He must have just grabbed his backpack and run off into the other field or maybe even tried chasing me through the grass without finding me. Either way, it clearly showed that his intentions were not just to rob me of my belongings, which makes the whole scenario 100 times more disturbing. I gave the police a description of the man, but there still haven't been any sightings. I was driving back from my friend's place in Wisconsin to my home right outside of Chicago, which is about a 6-hour drive that I decided to do all in one go. However, I didn't anticipate leaving so late and wasn't on the road until 8 p.m., but I absolutely had to be home for work the following day, so there was no option to stay longer. If you're not familiar with Wisconsin, it's mostly flat with tons of forests throughout the northern parts and small towns scattered around, with the biggest cities closer to the border and nowhere near where I was. My buddy's place was in one of these small towns, so pretty much right away I was driving through barren forest roads. There were a few cars here and there, but once I was 30 minutes out and the sun had set, there wasn't a single other car on the road. I probably went a whole 2 hours without seeing anyone else, and the endless flat forest on either side of me was so repetitive that it was making me sleepy. It definitely didn't help that I was already tired from hanging out with my friend all weekend. I was trying everything to stay awake, but at around 11 p.m. I actually saw something up the road. I opened my eyes wider and could tell it was a person standing on the shoulder with their thumb out, clearly looking for a ride. For some reason, the very first thought that came to my mind was that having company in the car would surely help keep me awake, so I almost instinctively began slowing down. As I got closer, they started walking down the shoulder toward my car. I rolled the window down and pulled up next to them, and they said they just needed a ride into the next town if I had a spare seat. It was really dark out and I couldn't see much of him, but he sounded tired, so I let him into the back seat. It wasn't until I started pulling away that the thought even occurred to me about why he was out here, because the middle of the woods in the middle of the night was kind of a weird place to be. Looking in the mirror, the guy was looking at me through the shadow that covered the back seat. He looked like he was around 30 with stubble and a buzz cut, but I didn't see a backpack or anything with him.
He asked what brought me out here, so I told him I was at my friend's place for the weekend and was heading back home to Chicago. Then I asked him the same question. His straight face turned into a fake smile as he said he was just walking on a trail in the woods and got lost along the way, found the road, and figured it was best to catch a ride. I thought about his answer for a second and realized I didn't know about any trails or really anything at all in these parts of the woods, but even if there was one, he would have had to drive to get here. Why didn't he mention that? Wouldn't he want me to take him to the trailhead instead of into town? I was more awake and aware now, and thinking about it was making me uneasy. Then the guy suddenly told me to stop and pull over to drop him off right there. I cautiously did as he said, pulling the car onto the shoulder and parking. We were maybe 5 miles down the road from where I picked him up, and there was still nothing but dense forest all around. The guy quickly opened the door, and without saying anything, he started rushing away toward the trees. I was really weirded out and concerned about this whole situation, and I just wanted to get out of there. But he had left the door open. When I leaned into the back seat to shut it, I noticed a drawstring bag tucked under the passenger seat that wasn't mine and was definitely his. I called out to the guy and he turned around, so I told him he had left his bag and pointed under the seat. He stood there with a straight face and wide, frustrated eyes, staring at me for several uncomfortable seconds before coming back. He hesitated for another several seconds before grabbing the bag abruptly and turning around, hurrying back into the forest. I reached over, shut the door, and left the area as fast as I could. I was relieved to be away from that guy, knowing something was definitely wrong with him. But it was only a few minutes down the road that I started to notice an awful odor coming from the back seat. It got increasingly worse over the next 30 minutes, until I reached another small town, where I stopped at a gas station and used my phone light to look into the back seat. On the carpet under the passenger seat, right where the drawstring bag had been sitting, there was a deep red stain. I almost threw up as I ran into the gas station and called the police. I gave them all the information I had about what happened, and they cut out the piece of carpet from my car to get it tested. They also searched for the man but came up empty-handed, only finding a few footprints near the spot where I had picked him up. I don't know exactly what was in that bag, but it seems like he was trying to plant it in my car to cover something up. We still have no idea who he was or what he was up to that night.
About 8 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I went camping alone in the remote forests of Upper Idaho, where the trails were quiet, the air smelled like pine and cold dirt, and the only company was the wind and the chance of bears. I avoided the popular lake nearby and took a lesser-known path that skirted the mountains and ended at a small clearing with a view of the range. I set up my tent, built a fire ring from big rocks, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and staring at the stars while the valley fell into that deep, heavy silence you only get far from people. That's when I heard it, the steady crunch of leaves in the dark, definitely footsteps, not an animal. A man stepped into the edge of the firelight with a backpack, his face hard to read in the flicker, and whispered, "Sorry," in this hushed, almost secretive way before turning around and walking back into the trees the exact way he came. Hours later, clouds swallowed the stars, and just as I was settling into the quiet again, the footsteps rushed back, faster and uneven, like someone who'd been running through brush. It was the same man, dirty, scraped, and breathing hard, eyes wide and skittish, never staying on me for more than a second before darting over my right shoulder like something was standing behind me. He asked strange questions in a tight, unnerving tone, why I was camping there, if I was alone, if I'd been following him, and then, after one long stare past me, said, "Then why are you with her?" I spun around and saw nothing but the dark wall of trees, and when I looked back, he broke into a full sprint straight into the woods, away from any trail, swallowed by the night in seconds. Fear hit me like a wave. I packed fast and left for the car, jumping at every sound on the walk out. The next morning I reported it, and after years of replaying that night and talking to people who know backcountry behavior, the most likely answer is that he'd been lost long enough to be dehydrated and paranoid, convinced someone was tracking him, too far gone to recognize help even when it was right in front of him. It's also possible he really was being followed and didn't trust me, and in scaring me off, he might have kept me out of danger. He was never found, which makes me think he didn't make it out, but the truth is we'll probably never know what he saw, or thought he saw, standing just over my shoulder. A month ago, during an all-nighter to finish overdue work, I left my office for more coffee and felt a sudden chill on the first floor, the kind that raises the hairs on your arms. The thermostat said the heat was on, but it was a few degrees colder than it should have been, and then I saw it, a window in the back of the living room, wide open like someone had lifted it and slipped inside. I checked the sill for marks, the dirt outside for footprints, anything that said intruder, and found nothing. Telling myself I must have left it that way, I closed it, went upstairs, and tried to focus. 30 minutes later, still uneasy, I walked the house quickly and found everything in place, so I returned to my desk, until a heavy thump hit the wall behind me, loud enough to stop my breath. My bedroom was on the other side, so I checked it first, expecting something obvious knocked to the floor, but the room was undisturbed. Back at my desk, the lingering wrongness wouldn't leave, and then it clicked. There was a narrow closet right behind me that I never used for anything but storing coats. I slid the door open without thinking and came face to face with a stranger wedged behind my jackets, close enough to touch me if not for the barrier of fabric. He exploded out of the closet as I stumbled into the hall, and when he called my name, my actual name, in this rough, unsettling voice I didn't recognize, fear turned electric. I bolted out of the house while he talked instead of chasing, like he wanted to coax me to stop rather than catch me. I pounded on a neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they searched my place, the man was gone, no clear trace of where he went, no obvious sign of entry except that open window I'd closed. Later, the realization hit like a second shock. He must have slipped in while I was downstairs checking the house after seeing the window, then hid a few feet behind me for at least an hour, watching me work, already knowing my name. That means it wasn't random, it was planned, targeted, and patient. I keep thinking that if I hadn't stayed up and walked downstairs for coffee, if I'd just gone to bed, I might not be here now. A few weeks after that, I left a small birthday get-together at around 1 a.m. a little buzzed, and decided to walk the 25 to 30 minutes home through quiet suburbs rather than risk driving. The streets were empty, no cars, no porch lights, that kind of deep neighborhood silence that makes your footsteps sound too loud. A car rolled up alongside me, the window cracked just enough for a man to ask if I needed a ride. He sounded polite, maybe even concerned, so I thanked him and said I was fine, and he drove on. Minutes later, I saw the same headlights behind me, the same car coming from the opposite direction now, easing to a stop and parking on the side of the road. He didn't get out, didn't say anything, just sat there while I kept moving, watching the mirrors until he disappeared behind a bend. Farther along, near a small park with an unlit path that cut through the woods, a shortcut I almost never used at night, I found the car again, idling in the middle of the road with its headlights pointed down the street, parked unusually close to the trail entrance like it was placed there on purpose. My first thought was to avoid the car by taking the path, but something felt staged, like the setup was waiting for me to choose the woods. I walked past the trail and close enough to see through the windshield, bracing for a confrontation, and saw no one in the driver's seat. Then I lifted my eyes to the tree line and spotted a man half hidden among the trunks, turned toward me, still and watching. I ran. The door of the car opened behind me, I heard him get in, the engine rev, and then, seeing my phone in my hand, he made a quick U-turn and sped off instead of following. I didn't stop until I was inside my building. I called the police and reported everything, the timings, the route, the way the car leapfrogged me, the empty driver's seat near the trail, the figure in the trees. It felt exactly like a trap designed to pull me off the street and into the dark path where there were no houses, no lights, and no witnesses. With only a car description and a voice, there isn't much to go on, and it's likely no one will ever be charged, but I keep thinking how easily I could have stepped into that park and vanished without a sound.
In my early 20s, I lived in a small house on the rural edge of the city with 3 other guys from my college. We didn't really know each other beforehand, but graduating at the same time and splitting rent 4 ways made the place doable. After about 9 months, 2 of them moved out abruptly, leaving me with KJ, the quiet one who was always gone or kept to himself. Rent doubled for the two of us, so we agreed to finish the last 3 months of the lease and then go our separate ways. Once it was just us, his absence felt even stranger. On my days off, I'd have the place to myself from morning to night. I didn't mind the quiet, but something about how he seemed to disappear for such long stretches got under my skin. One night around 1 a.m., I saw headlights bounce along the gravel driveway and heard the front door. I stepped out to say a quick hello so things didn't get more awkward between us. But KJ rushed down the hall and froze outside his door, eyes wide and unblinking in the dark. He muttered that he was fine, then shut himself in. A few minutes later, drawers began opening and closing in a frantic rhythm, then dead silence, like he'd frozen in place. When I paused near his door, he suddenly threw it open and stared the same hollow way, forcing me to cover by saying I was just grabbing something from the kitchen. For the next week, I stayed up until he got home, uneasy until I knew he was in his room. He moved like a sleepwalker, barely spoke, and avoided me completely. Then one night, he knocked on my door with a stiff half smile and asked if I'd help him look for his wallet. I grabbed a flashlight and followed him outside, where I noticed his car was parked way down the driveway for no apparent reason. We walked the gravel all the way to it without finding anything, and he kept steering me past the car and off the driveway, deeper toward the woods. Every time I suggested turning back, he tried to keep me moving forward. It felt wrong, too insistent, too rehearsed, and the anxiety in my chest told me to leave. I offered him the flashlight, said I had to be up early, and started heading back. His fake smile disappeared. His restless eyes hardened. He didn't say a word. I walked faster, glanced back to see him standing still and watching me, and once inside, I packed what mattered. I didn't sleep, listening for any movement, but he never came back that night. In the morning, I loaded my car and left. I never heard from him again, and I can't shake the feeling he was trying to lure me into the woods for something terrible. I spent 2 years living with my college roommate Jason near our old campus. We weren't best friends, but we got along, and the first year went smoothly enough that we renewed the lease. One night after a late shift, I went to bed and woke around 3 a.m. to slow, deliberate creaking across the hallway, moving toward the main room. I assumed it was Jason getting water and fell back asleep. In the morning, he asked if I'd been walking around. I hadn't, and I'd thought it was him. So we brushed it off as the house settling. The next night, the same creeping footfalls traveled from the hallway to the living room. When I went to check, the space was empty and quiet. Later the following evening, I came home around 11 and saw Jason sitting on the edge of his bed as I passed his open door. I said, "What's up?" and kept walking, but he didn't respond. Minutes later, his light was off and he was still sitting there in the dark. It was odd, but I left him alone and went to the kitchen. About an hour after I returned to my room, the floorboards outside my door groaned again, and a shadow slid across the gap under the door. Rather than step out, I texted Jason to ask if it was him. He replied with a question mark, then said he wasn't home. Cold dread hit me. I opened my door and saw no one in the hall, but Jason's door, closed a little earlier, was open again. I edged toward the room and peered inside. In the pitch black, a tall man with a thick beard stood in the center of the room facing me. I ran outside and called the police from across the street. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. There were no obvious signs of a break-in, just a window that was slightly unlocked but didn't look freshly open. We realized the slow, nightly footsteps we'd both heard were likely his, wandering our place while we slept. The most chilling part was where he'd chosen to wait, sitting in Jason's room on the one evening when I worked late and Jason would typically be home alone. It felt like he'd studied our routines and was waiting for the right moment. We never learned who he was or what he wanted. In 2015, when I was 23, I used Craigslist to find a roommate and connected with a woman named Hannah, who said she was also 23 and still in college. On the phone, she seemed normal and aligned with what I needed. In person, she looked a bit older than her age, but I figured appearances can be deceiving and moved forward. Within a week, she'd moved in. For the first few days, our schedules kept us from seeing much of each other. On the fifth night, I came home around 10 p.m. and heard someone rush down the hallway and slam a door. My bedroom door, which I knew I'd closed before leaving, was open. Nothing looked disturbed, so I tried to shrug it off. Later, while I watched TV, I noticed a dark shape under the crack of my door. Someone standing perfectly still just outside. When I called out, the shadow drifted away and a door slammed, presumably hers. In the morning, I asked if she needed anything last night. She smiled and said everything was fine. The next night, I returned to a quiet, dark apartment, kept my movements light so I wouldn't wake her, chatted briefly with a friend, and took a shower. When I stepped out, my bedroom door to the hall was open again, even though I was almost certain I'd locked it when I got home. I locked it then, unsettled but trying to be rational. Sometime after I fell asleep, I jolted awake to a suffocating quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring, and saw my door cracked open a few inches, despite being sure I'd secured it. I whispered her name. No answer. As my eyes adjusted, I scanned the room and found her standing in the corner near my wardrobe, facing me without speaking or moving, a blank, distant look on her face. She took one step closer, then suddenly sprinted out. Her door slammed a heartbeat later. I grabbed my keys and phone, ran to my car and called the police from a safer spot. When officers arrived and we tried to reach her, she was gone, most of her belongings taken in a rush. That's when everything fell apart. The name she'd given me didn't match any records. Her phone was a prepaid burner, and the details she'd provided were fabricated. I moved soon after, convinced that if I'd stayed longer, whatever she had planned would have escalated. Even years later, the unanswered questions and how close I was to learning the answers the hard way still haunt me.
During a time in my life when I was mostly living on the road, I made steady money by house sitting and dog sitting. It was easy to pick up short-term jobs, and the best part was getting paid to stay in gorgeous homes for days or even weeks. This week, I was booked to watch a house in Washington and care for a large golden retriever named Apple. I drove up on Thursday, met the owners, and instantly liked Apple. She was gentle, friendly, and eager to be close. An hour after I arrived, the owners headed out for their vacation, and I started settling in. The house was huge, modern, and tucked deep into a remote part of a national forest. The long driveway took about 3 minutes to walk end to end, and there were no other houses in sight. It felt almost unreal to be there, like I had stepped into a quiet, private world. That first evening I played with Apple, ate dinner, and took her for a walk around 7 p.m. along the silent, tree-lined road. As we got back to the driveway, a man appeared, walking down from its direction. He looked about 30, with short black hair and baggy jeans, head down, saying nothing as he passed. The driveway had no other connections and there were no nearby homes, so I couldn't figure out where he had come from except the property itself. A knot formed in my stomach. I hurried Apple into the house and locked the doors. I told myself he could have been wandering the woods and stumbled onto the driveway by chance. Nothing else happened that night, and I went to bed around 10, still replaying that quiet, strange moment in my mind. The next day was calm. I stayed inside, explored rooms, and got used to the layout, the soaring ceilings, the big windows, the upstairs balcony with a fire pit, and a row of spare bedrooms down a long hallway. After sunset I lit the fire on the balcony and relaxed in the cool air. Apple rested beside me for a while, then wandered into her bed. Around 11:30 p.m., she started barking from inside, sudden, loud, and panicked. Apple was so sweet that hearing her bark like that made my heart race. I rushed in from the balcony and followed the sound down the hallway. One of the spare bedroom doors was open. Apple stood inside with her tail tucked, barking toward a closet door and refusing to look away. I called her name, but she wouldn't budge. I moved closer, reached for the closet door, and cracked it open. The room beyond was pitch black. I couldn't find a light switch, but I could make out hanging clothes in a walk-in closet. Then I saw it, a thin gap between coats where an eye stared straight at me. For a second I froze. Then I slammed the door and heard the hangers clatter as something shifted inside. I grabbed Apple by the collar, ran downstairs, and drove off with shaking hands, dialing 911. The police arrived quickly and searched the property, but whoever was there had already slipped away. I told the officers about the man I'd seen on the driveway the night before, though I couldn't say for sure it was the same person. They thought someone likely knew the family was traveling and expected the house to be empty. What he intended to do wasn't clear. What scared me most was the possibility he knew I was there the whole time and hid anyway. Apple's barking probably saved me from walking into that closet. After the officers finished, I stayed elsewhere for the night and kept thinking about how quiet that house had felt, and how not alone it really was. I worked nights as a maintenance person for a small business. They run everything during the day, so my 8 p.m. to midnight shift lets me clean and repair without getting in anyone's way. One evening I arrived a little late, clocked in, and started wiping down desks and emptying bins. Around 9 p.m., the front desk phone started ringing. Since the business had closed at 6 p.m. and my boss always used my cell, I ignored it. It rang again a couple of minutes later, and then again, and again. The caller ID just showed unknown caller. I walked up, stared at the screen, and debated whether to answer and say we were closed. I didn't want the hassle, so I muted the phone and went back to work. After about half an hour, I forgot about it. At around 10 p.m., I took a break upstairs in the small coffee room. That's when I heard a single, sharp electronic beep from downstairs, a sound I didn't recognize. A second later, a door opened and shut. I turned toward the stairwell, confused. No one should have been entering at that hour. I walked to the open stairwell and called out, "Hello? Is someone down there?" Footsteps stopped as soon as I spoke. The sudden silence made my skin prickle. I waited and called again. A few steps echoed closer to the bottom of the stairs. I leaned just enough to see the ground floor entry and caught the still shadow of a man standing just inside, like he was waiting for me to come down. My chest tightened. I moved back into the coffee room, crouched behind the bar height table, and dialed 911 in a whisper. The first officer arrived within minutes, announced himself loudly, and swept the building. He came all the way upstairs without finding anyone. Only when we pulled the security footage did we learn what happened. The man had entered with a key card, stood at the bottom of the stairs for several minutes holding a knife, and barely reacted to anything, calm, steady, almost bored. He didn't seem to know I was there until I called out. After that, he looked ready to hurt anyone who stepped into his path. He left through the front door just before the officer arrived. The scariest part was the beep I'd heard. It was the door reader accepting a key card. I didn't even have one, just a metal key. How he got access is still a mystery, and the case remains open. The company changed codes and reviewed every card on file. I still work there, but the building feels different at night now. I keep my phone in my pocket, check the stairwell before breaks, and listen for every little sound. Most nights are quiet, and I tell myself it was a one-time thing. Still, when the air conditioner kicks on or a pipe thumps, I remember that shadow waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Trevor is a college freshman with a helpful family, so his big expenses are covered. To pay for food and hangouts with friends, he does Uber Eats a few nights a week. His Honda Accord is ancient, loud, and slow to start, but it gets him through deliveries. One night around 10 p.m., he picked up an order from Wendy's and followed the app's directions down an empty stretch of highway. The drop-off led to a gravel road that cut into dense forest. There were no streetlights, and his dim headlights only lit up about 10 feet ahead. He crept along until the road ended at a blank wall of trees. His app said he'd arrived, but there was no driveway, no mailbox, no house, just dark woods. He stepped out, holding the warm paper bag, and walked a few feet into the headlights' glow. Still nothing. He turned to get back in the car, and then noticed a small, dim light deeper in the trees. It was steady, not moving, almost like a porch light. He took a few careful steps toward it to see if there was a path. Before he could make sense of it, the light shifted behind a tree and disappeared. The forest went back to silent dark. The hair on his neck stood up. He took a step back toward his car and heard leaves crunch directly ahead, the sound of footsteps moving toward him but still hidden in the black between trunks. He dropped the bag, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine coughed, stuttered, and finally caught. He made a tight three-point turn, gravel popping under the tires. As he started down the lane, his side headlight beam swept across a man sprinting through the woods toward the road, angling to cut him off. Trevor pressed the gas. The car rattled forward just fast enough to pass before the man emerged. No one followed, the road behind him stayed empty and quiet. He didn't slow down until he hit the highway. He ended his shift immediately and drove home with his heart still thudding. Later, he pulled up the location on Google Maps. There were no houses anywhere near that dead-end road. It was just a forgotten stretch of gravel with forest on all sides. He reported the drop-off as undeliverable and flagged the location, then sat there thinking about that single, dim light in the trees. Was it a lure? Were there more people waiting in the dark? He didn't have answers, but he knew he'd been lucky. Now, when an address looks strange or a road disappears into nowhere, he calls the customer first, keeps the engine running, and trusts his gut. Sometimes a quiet night isn't quiet at all, it's just quiet until you notice what's there. After another overnight shift at the warehouse a few miles from home, I drove back in that hazy state where I wasn't nodding off, but I wasn't fully alert either. I parked on the street like usual, slipped through the front door, and climbed the stairs on autopilot. As soon as I hit the mattress, that deep, heavy relief washed over me, the kind you feel only after a long, grinding night, and I fell asleep within minutes. When I woke up, I felt just as drained, maybe more. It was still dark outside, so it couldn't have been more than an hour. I rolled over, ready to drift off again, when something caught my eye. My bedroom door was open. That stopped me cold because I never sleep with it open, it's a habit I don't even think about. I got up slowly, crossed the room, and looked down the dark hallway. I pulled the door shut, and the instant it clicked, I heard a sound somewhere on the other side of the house, something moving, brief and low, then silence. The quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise itself. Trying to convince myself I was overreacting, I opened the door and crossed to the second bedroom, the one with just a bed and a dresser. Nothing seemed out of place. I turned to head back, and that's when I heard a closet door creak in the hallway between me and my room. A man stepped out, and we locked eyes. I knew his face from somewhere, though I couldn't place it. Instinct kicked in. I slammed the bedroom door and locked it. Footsteps pounded down the stairs, the front door opened, and he was gone. I called 911 once I felt safe moving again. The police found no signs of forced entry and said I must have left the front door unlocked. Maybe I was tired enough to do that, but it's a habit I do without thinking, and it didn't sit right with me. Nothing was missing, but the part one can't shake is knowing he likely opened my bedroom door while I slept. I keep wondering if he recognized me too, and that changed whatever he planned. I still don't know where I've seen him, maybe the grocery store, maybe walking in the city, but the coincidence gnaws at me. Last August, I took a week off for a staycation after my roommate moved out. Living alone was supposed to be quiet and relaxing, a chance to enjoy the space I'd been too busy to appreciate. On the second day around midday, I heard someone on the porch. No knock, no doorbell. After a minute, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the peephole. A man in his mid-30s wearing a light sweatshirt and black jeans stood off to the side, not directly in front of the door, scanning around like he was looking for something. After about 45 seconds, he walked away and got into a car parked by my neighbor's place. I went outside, saw nothing obvious, and eventually let it go. That night, there was a knock. The same man stood there, this time waiting for me to open up. I cracked the door just enough to talk. He launched into a story about his car breaking down and pointed to the very same car I'd seen earlier. He asked to borrow my phone for a quick call. It felt wrong, like a setup, so I told him no and closed the door. Through the peephole, I watched his face shift from fake friendly to furious. He pounded on the door, and I yelled that I was calling the police. He paused, then walked toward the side of the house instead of leaving. I dialed 911 immediately. Less than a minute later, a crash exploded from the dining room. He'd smashed the window and was climbing inside. I tried to sprint for the garage and the car, but he caught up fast. He grabbed me, overpowered me, and hissed at me to be quiet while dragging me toward the front door, toward his car. I fought as much as I could. A person walking a dog across the street noticed us and started running over. Before they reached us, he let me go, bolted to his car, and sped off. The police arrived, took my statement, and tried to track him down, but he was never found. They think his first visit might have been to place or retrieve a hidden camera or microphone. I haven't seen him again, but I plan to move. I don't want to wait around to learn what he had in mind. I live in a small, older townhouse in a modest city, nothing fancy, just what I can afford on my own. One evening between 8 and 9, I pulled into the shared driveway and noticed my connected neighbor's front door standing wide open, lights off inside. I figured they'd forgotten to shut it and went about my night. I ate a bowl of Frosted Flakes, put on Netflix, and forced myself to turn in early for a morning shift. In my bedroom, which shares a wall with theirs, I heard a couple of dull thumps from their side, rare for them, but not alarming. I turned off the lights and tried to settle. A single, violent hit shattered the quiet. My front door was smashed open. I jumped out of bed and ran to the hall. Splinters and debris were scattered across the floor, the door hanging open. Heavy footsteps thundered through the living room, and I realized there was more than one intruder. I tried to retreat, but two large men in masks and hoodies cornered me, one gripping a baseball bat, the other holding a metal ramming tool that must have taken out the door. They barked orders and forced me to the ground. One pressed my head hard to the floor while the other swept through the house, shoving things into a backpack. I was panicking, trying to keep my voice steady, telling them I wouldn't interfere if they just left me alone. After a couple of minutes, the one who was grabbing items rushed back, shouting about something outside. Both men ran to the window, then stormed back, shoving and threatening me before bolting for the back door. They were too late. Police had already surrounded the house. My neighbors had come home to find their own front door kicked in and called 911 immediately. Officers ordered the men to surrender, and they did. Later I learned the pair were just regular guys looking for quick cash. They'd hit my neighbor's place first. I walked away with bruises and a destroyed front door, shaken but safe, and, unlike the other times, with the intruders headed to prison. I worked nights at a small gas station on an old two-lane road deep in rural Tennessee. Before they built the new freeway a decade ago, this stretch was busy: diners, a couple of motels, some small shops, but once traffic moved, almost everything died. Now most of the buildings sit empty, boarded, or broken into, fading under peeling paint and busted windows. Sometimes someone from the local drug scene drifts in and squats for a bit, but most nights the whole road feels abandoned. When the sun goes down, the place feels like it holds its breath. On my shift last night, I clocked in at 8 to an empty lot and a store so quiet I could hear the lights buzzing and the cooler's compressor hum. Shadows drifted across the glass whenever the cooler kicked on, and that tiny movement only made the stillness feel heavier. I knew it would be slow. In this area after dark, the only people who stop are lost, running on fumes, or desperate to use the bathroom. I've been here about a year. I'm 18, and the night shift isn't bad when nothing happens. I can play some music, watch videos, and scroll my phone, and no one bothers me. But if something does happen, it's just me. There isn't any backup coming unless I make the call. Around 11, half watching a YouTube video, I remembered the chip rack was almost empty, the one thing people actually buy around here. I'd been putting it off because the extra boxes aren't in a convenient back room, they're in the basement. I hate that basement. The staircase is steep and narrow, the air is damp and smells like mildew and wet cardboard, and there's a single tired bulb that throws a weak yellow cone across shelves and old boxes. The corners stay dark no matter how long the light's on, and sound bounces around in a way that makes it hard to tell where anything is. I never stay down there a second longer than I have to. Still, I grabbed the key, unlocked the heavy wood door, and started down. Halfway to the bottom, the cooler air wrapped around me and the smell got stronger. I was 5 steps from the floor when I heard a sharp metallic clink, like a small object hitting concrete. Then came footsteps. Not a shelf settling. not a drip. Measured footsteps, steady, coming from the far end of the room toward the stairs. I froze, listening, hoping I had imagined it. The steps kept coming, even, deliberate, too clear to mistake. That was enough. I turned, took the stairs two at a time, slammed the door, threw the lock, and stepped back with my heart thudding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the keys. I went straight to the counter and pulled up the security feeds. One camera looks down the basement from the top of the stairs. When it loaded, my stomach dropped. A man stood directly under the camera's gaze, centered in the frame, staring up and smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. His eyes were wide and bright, and his mouth was pulled too far back, like he was stretching his face on purpose. He didn't look like a drifter, no tangled beard, no filthy layers. He was clean-shaven, in jeans and a light blue button-up. If he had walked in the front door, I would have rung him up without a second thought. Seeing him in that damp basement, holding still and smiling into the lens, felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe. I called my boss. He sounded annoyed at first, but as I explained what I was seeing, he got quiet and said he'd be there in 15 minutes. I asked if I should call the police. He told me no, not yet, lock the front door and keep an eye on the camera to make sure the guy didn't come up or leave. I locked up and watched the monitor. The man didn't move. He just stared and smiled. 3 minutes later, he shifted, still keeping eye contact with the camera as he slid sideways toward the far corner where the light didn't reach. Then the shadows swallowed him, and he disappeared. Somehow, that felt worse than when he was standing in full view. When I could see him, at least I knew where he was. Now he could have been anywhere, right under the stairs, halfway up them, or pressed flat against the wall below the camera. When my boss pulled in, I let him in immediately. He came in with a shotgun like he'd been expecting something to go wrong. We went down together. The wooden steps groaned, and I scanned every corner for movement. But there was nothing. No one in the open, no shifting shadows, no sign of a person at all. The floor looked undisturbed. No wet footprints, no scuffs in the dust, no moved boxes. Just that heavy, damp air pressing on our ears. After a slow sweep, my boss shrugged and said I was probably tired and got spooked, but I know what I saw on that camera. We went back upstairs, and he told me not to worry about it. I nodded, but the rest of the night I kept one eye glued to the basement feed. Nothing else happened, but that stretched smile stuck in my mind. When I was 18, there was another night that still makes my chest tighten. It was somewhere around 4 in the morning. I couldn't sleep and decided to drive to a gas station for a snack. The place was quiet and bright in that harsh fluorescent way, the lot empty, one clerk inside, no other cars in sight. I grabbed a hot dog and some chips, paid, and went back to my car. I left the music low and sat there eating, the driver's window cracked a few inches to let the warm air move. It felt calm and still, until a sharp tap hit the glass. I jumped so hard I almost dropped my food and instinctively hit the lock button. A man stood inches from the window, leaning down to meet my eyes. Late 20s or early 30s, messy hair, dark hoodie, no readable expression, which made me wary. I rolled the window just a bit more to hear him and asked, "What's up?" He didn't hesitate. "Get out of the car," he said. I blinked. "What?" "I'm taking this car." "Get out." That's when I saw the knife. He wasn't tapping with his knuckles. The blade was resting against the glass. My body went cold all at once. I looked around. The lot was empty. The clerk wasn't watching. The guy stood a step back like he didn't want to look suspicious from inside, but his eyes kept flicking, to me, to the door, to the store, to the emptiness of the lot. Everything in me said, do not open this door. If I stepped out, nothing would stop him from driving off or hurting me. I forced my voice calm. "Okay, just a second." I moved my right hand toward the seat belt like I was about to unbuckle, and with my left, I slid to the window switch. It took him a second to notice, and in that moment I hit the button and the glass started up. He tried to jab the knife through the gap. It scraped down the window with a loud, ugly squeal. He yanked the handle hard, then again. I threw the car in reverse, heart pounding so loud it drowned the music. He started shouting something I barely heard, waving the knife, and jogged a couple steps as I backed out, but I was already turning. As I pulled onto the street, I saw the clerk on the phone, watching me leave. I drove straight home and called the police from my driveway, hands shaking so badly I could hardly hold the phone. An officer said they'd gotten another call about the same guy earlier that night. They thought they knew who he was, but I never heard what happened after. For weeks, my mind replayed how fast it happened and how close I'd come to making a fatal mistake by stepping out. Ever since, I avoid gas stations late at night, especially empty ones. I grew up in a small town of about 6,000 where nights were so quiet your footsteps echoed down empty streets. My family took walks after dark all the time, and we rarely saw anyone. It felt safe, though my parents still drilled the "don't talk to strangers" rule into me. I'm short, and back then at 16 or 17 I looked even younger, so they didn't want me wandering into trouble. Those warnings felt like tradition more than necessity, until we moved a few miles away to a larger town with a worse reputation. People told us not to go out alone at night. I believed them in theory, but nothing had happened to me yet. One night around 10:30, my mom's boyfriend had a bad stomach ache and asked for Tums. My mom's car was dead, so she asked me to take mine. The gas station was under 5 minutes away, and the streets were almost empty, just the hum of streetlights and a few parked cars under yellow pools of light. I pulled into the lot and aimed for a spot near the entrance. That's when I saw a man in a dark hoodie standing just off to the side of the doors, one hand up like my headlights were blinding him, which was odd because my headlights are terrible. I kept him in my peripheral vision, parked, locked my car, and headed in without making eye contact. Inside was dead quiet. No clerk, no customers, only the refrigerators buzzing. I went straight to the medicine aisle. No Tums, not even a generic. I double-checked the shelf but didn't linger, something in me wanted out. When I pushed open the door to leave, I paused. The man was no longer by the entrance, and a car had parked tight against the driver's side of mine, close enough I'd have to squeeze in. That car hadn't been there when I arrived. I walked faster but kept my head steady, eyes scanning without turning. I got in and locked the door immediately. Not even a heartbeat later, the man came from behind the car next to mine, moving fast like he'd been crouched out of sight. He grabbed my handle and yanked, then started pounding on the glass, shouting for me to open the door and let him in. I didn't wait. I turned the key, the engine caught, and I floored it, tires squealing as I shot out of the lot. My hands shook so badly I barely kept the wheel straight until I was halfway across town. I stopped at another station, bought the Tums, and drove straight home. I didn't tell the full story until morning because I needed a few hours to process how close I'd come to God knows what. Since then, I don't go anywhere alone at night if I can help it, not gas stations, not grocery stores, nowhere, because I can't stop thinking about that exact second. If I hadn't locked my door immediately, he would have been inside before I could react.
Here are 3 chilling wilderness encounters that highlight the very real dangers that can lurk in remote areas. The first story takes place in Washington State, where a solo backpacker was deep in the national parks, about 20 miles from the nearest road during early fall when the cold weather kept most people away. After 2 days of seeing no one, the hiker encountered a strange man on the trail who had no gear whatsoever, just wearing a long-sleeved shirt and old hiking pants with no backpack, water, or supplies. This was puzzling since they were miles from any established campsite, but the hiker continued on to his destination. Hours later at his remote campsite, the same mysterious man appeared again, having somehow changed direction and followed him there. The man sat down nearby without any camping gear and simply stared into the forest, completely ignoring the hiker's presence. As darkness fell, the situation became increasingly unsettling, and when the hiker began packing up to leave, the man finally looked at him and never looked away, maintaining intense eye contact. The man then stood up and began following the hiker as he fled down the trail in the dark. The hiker eventually veered off into the woods to hide, and while the pursuer called out in a fake friendly voice trying to lure him back, he eventually disappeared into the forest on the opposite side of the trail. The hiker waited over an hour before making his escape, skipping his next planned campsite entirely and reporting the incident to police once he reached town, though they never followed up. The second story involves Jake, a complete camping novice who chose what seemed like a safe, moderately populated campground for his first outdoor experience. After setting up his tent and meeting some friendly fellow campers, a guy named TJ around his age invited him to see a hidden lake nearby that supposedly nobody knew about. What started as a friendly 10-minute walk through the woods on a thin footpath quickly turned sinister when Nye became eerily quiet and kept checking the sunset as if waiting for darkness to fall. After 20 minutes of walking with no lake in sight, Jake's instincts kicked in and he began putting distance between them. When Jake attempted to quietly run back toward the campsite, TJ immediately noticed and gave chase, first calling out in his fake friendly persona before switching to frustrated yelling as he sprinted through the woods. The terrifying pursuit lasted about a minute before Jake heard a metallic thud behind him and glimpsed what appeared to be a knife ricocheting off a tree near him. TJ's final, desperate attempt to stop his escape. Jake managed to lose his pursuer and returned to the other campers, who called police and revealed that TJ had been at the campsite when they arrived but had no tent or gear anywhere, suggesting he was specifically targeting inexperienced solo campers. The third encounter occurred in Montana, where a traveler was living out of a truck camper and had to stop for the night at a remote public land camping spot after truck troubles delayed his journey. The location was a small grass circle surrounded by woods, accessed by a quarter-mile dirt path, and he was completely alone when he parked facing the exit and settled in for the night around 11 or 12. Within minutes of lying down, headlights appeared coming down the path, and instead of finding another spot, the vehicle stopped at the entrance, completely blocking his only way out. The old, rust-covered truck sat there with headlights blazing directly at his camper, and after several minutes, two men emerged and began walking toward him in the dark, carrying what appeared to be tools or weapons. One man approached his camper door with what looked like a crowbar or sledgehammer and began trying to force it open, while the other positioned himself nearby. Just as the situation reached its most desperate point, a gunshot rang out from the surrounding woods, causing both men to immediately flee back to their truck and speed away. The traveler believes a hunter or nearby camper witnessed the attempted break-in and fired a warning shot to save him, though given the remote location, he acknowledges this explanation seems almost too fortunate to believe. Regardless of who fired that shot, it likely saved his life and prevented his truck and camper from ending up anonymously sold online while he disappeared forever.
This happened just a few months ago while I was working overnight shifts at a warehouse. Since I work nights, I keep the same sleep schedule even on days off, staying awake from 6 p.m. to around 9 or 10 a.m. One night after finishing work at 4 a.m., I drove home through empty streets and arrived around 4:15. That's when I noticed something odd. An old black sedan with heavily tinted windows parked right next to my driveway. The car had no lights on and I couldn't see inside at all. This seems strange because in my neighborhood, houses are spaced far apart with plenty of parking spots, so there was no reason to park specifically by my house. I assumed it was someone visiting neighbors and went inside. An hour later, the car was gone. The next night, the same thing happened, the mysterious car appeared again in the exact same spot. This time I walked closer to investigate and thought I saw movement inside, though it could have been a reflection. I took a photo of the license plate just in case and went inside. Again, the car disappeared later. On my night off, I went for a walk around the neighborhood, and when I returned, the car was back. This time I pressed my face against the window to look inside. It was completely empty. When I got back inside, I found a motion alert from my security camera. Watching the footage from my bedroom camera, I saw someone quickly pass by the bottom of the frame in the last few seconds. My blood ran cold as I realized someone had been inside my house while I was out walking. I heard movement behind me as I tried to leave the room, then footsteps chasing me down the hallway. I ran straight into the woods without looking back. Police arrived and found the car gone, but using my license plate photo, they caught the intruder within 3 hours. He was a deranged man in his 20s who had been stalking me for 2 weeks, taking photos of my house and tracking my daily schedule. Most disturbing was that we never figured out how he got inside undetected, suggesting this might not have been his first break-in. 4 years ago, I was working as an Uber driver during a terrible storm. These nights were usually slow since nobody wanted to go out in bad weather, but I always stayed out hoping for a few rides. After waiting in parking lots for hours with no requests, I finally got a pickup notification. The passenger was 25 minutes away and needed to go another 20 minutes beyond that. Usually this means I'm the only available driver. The drive took me through increasingly remote areas until I reached the pickup location at the intersection of 2 roads surrounded by empty fields and trees. Nobody was there when I arrived. As I was texting the passenger to ask where they were, someone suddenly appeared at my car and got in. He was completely soaked and had a disturbing, angry expression. I had no idea where he had come from since I hadn't seen anyone around. During the drive, he sat directly behind me staring at me through the rearview mirror, which made me extremely uncomfortable. When I tried making friendly conversation about what brought him out in the storm, he ignored me completely and became more agitated. Suddenly he demanded I drop him off in the middle of nowhere. As he was about to leave, I noticed him looking at my phone with the Uber app open, and I could see the realization hit him that his information was recorded. I quickly offered to cancel the ride, hoping to ease his concerns, and he left into the storm. Days later, police called me because someone had gone missing that night near where I had picked up the passenger. I was the last person to see the man I drove, and neither he nor the missing person was ever found. The storm had washed away any evidence, and I believe I was very lucky not to become another victim that night. This happened on what should have been a normal weekday in early April during a particularly rainy period. My job involved both indoor and outdoor work, so rainy days were exhausting. After finishing my shift at 6 p.m., I drove 30 minutes home through the rain to my rural house. When I pulled into my muddy driveway, I noticed fresh tire tracks from another vehicle that had driven up to my house and turned around. I assumed it was a delivery truck, but there were no packages at my door. After changing out of my wet work clothes and making dinner, I thought I heard a quiet knock at the front door around 7:30. When I checked, nobody was there despite the fresh sound. Later, while walking to the bathroom, I discovered a small mud spot on my white tile floor behind the couch. This was strange because I never wore shoes inside, especially muddy ones. I cleaned it up but felt increasingly uneasy, like I was being watched. The feeling became so strong that I retreated upstairs to my bedroom where I felt safer with my back against the wall. About 20 minutes later, I heard a muffled thump from outside my room. When I investigated the hallway, it was empty, but suddenly the TV downstairs turned on at full volume. My heart pounded as I ran downstairs to find the living room empty except for the flickering TV light. I turned off the TV and grabbed a knife to search the house, finding nothing unusual on the first floor. Upstairs in the spare room, I discovered the downstairs TV remote lying on the floor by the closet. Terrified, I ran outside and called police. They found evidence of a break-in through a downstairs window and determined that someone had visited during the day while I was at work, knocked to see if I was home, then returned later to break in. The intruder had been hiding in my house all evening, watching me, and had turned on the TV as a distraction when I got too close to their hiding spot. The most chilling part was that nothing was stolen, leaving their true purpose unknown.
I'm 32 now, so Halloween doesn't bring the same kind of excitement it did when I was younger. No more running through the streets with a pillowcase full of candy. No more laughing with friends until my throat hurt. No more pure fun. Now it's just decorations. A bowl of candy by the door, and maybe a few movies to kill the night. Nothing crazy, nothing special, but at least it makes me feel like I'm participating in the holiday. This was back in 2021. That morning I cleaned the house, vacuumed, wiped down the counters, lit a candle or two to keep the place from smelling stale, and then later I stopped by the store to pick up the candy I'd be handing out, the big mixed bags with chocolates and gummies. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to go down, and I felt ready. Like I'd done my part, so I turned on a horror movie and left the front door cracked open just enough that I could hear the street, figuring I'd notice if kids came up the walkway. My neighborhood isn't very big, mostly older couples or young families who keep to themselves, so I usually don't get more than 10 or 15 trick-or-treaters at most. But that year felt wrong. 2 hours went by. Not a single knock. Not one voice, not even the sound of kids running down the street. I got up, checked the window, and saw the street completely still. No costumes, no kids, just porch lights glowing on empty sidewalks. It looked like the entire neighborhood had gone to sleep early, which made the silence even worse. I sat back down, tried to relax, but something about the quiet felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing in on my chest. At exactly 6:30, my doorbell rang, the sound so sudden that I almost jumped. Relieved, I grabbed the candy bowl, but when I turned toward the door, my relief died instantly. The door was still cracked, and through the gap I could see a face already looking inside. A mask, pure white, with holes cut only for the eyes, and those eyes were staring straight into mine without blinking. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the door a little more, enough to act normal, enough to not let them know how much they startled me, and I held out the bowl, forcing a casual smile, telling them to take a handful. They stepped closer, slow, deliberate, and as they leaned in, I realized something wasn't right. They weren't short like a kid. They weren't giggling or saying trick or treat. They were tall, their shoulders broad, and their eyes. Their eyes told me everything. The whites were bloodshot, streaked with red like they hadn't slept in days, and under them were heavy dark circles that made their skin look sunken and sickly. My stomach twisted. This was not a child. I didn't want to embarrass them. Didn't want to risk making things worse, so I stayed quiet, let them grab the candy, and watched as they turned and walked down the driveway. I sat back down, heart still thumping in my ears, convincing myself I was just overthinking.
It was almost midnight when I pulled into the gas station on the edge of town. I had driven that road dozens of times before, but at night it always felt different. Emptier, lonelier, as if the world thinned out once the sun went down. The station itself looked tired, half its overhead lights flickering, the rest buzzing faintly, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. The lot was deserted except for my car and an old pickup parked near the far pump, its paint rusted, its headlights clouded over. A single light above it flickered on and off, making it look as though the truck appeared and disappeared with each stutter of the bulb. The air was sharp and cold, and every sound seemed too loud. The crunch of my tires rolling to a stop, the metallic clink of the pump handle. Even the soft beep as I slid my card into the reader seemed to echo across the empty lot. I pressed the nozzle into the tank and kept my eyes fixed on the numbers ticking upward, trying to ignore the stillness around me. That's when I noticed him. The man in the pickup. He was sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, his posture stiff, his hands resting motionless on the wheel. His head faced forward, but even from a distance, I felt certain he was aware of me. Watching, waiting. I told myself not to stare, but curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over once quickly. He didn't move, not an inch, not a blink. I tried to shake it off. People sat in their cars all the time. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he lived out here and was resting before heading home. But the longer I stood there, the heavier the air seemed to press down on me. My stomach tightened, my pulse picked up. I gripped the nozzle a little too hard, silently begging the pump to hurry. Finally, it clicked off. Relieved, I slid it back into place and looked over once more. This time, his head was turned directly toward me. His face was buried in shadow, but I didn't need to see his eyes to know they were locked onto mine. The chill that ran through me was instant, deep, like ice water poured down my spine. I dropped my gaze, shoved my hands into my pockets, and walked quickly toward the station store, telling myself not to look back. But I did. Just once, his truck door was open. The driver's seat was empty. Inside, the clerk barely lifted his head from his phone as I pushed open the door. The little bell above it jingled too loudly, breaking the silence. I pretended to browse, trying to slow my breathing, my hand shaking as I grabbed a soda from the cooler. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe he'd just gone inside before me, that I'd see him in one of the aisles if I looked carefully enough. But when I turned to head toward the counter, I froze. Through the glass doors at the back of the store, I could see my car, and the man was there, standing right beside it. His hand dragged slowly across the driver's side window, leaving a faint streak with each movement. The clerk didn't notice. He just mumbled something about the total without even glancing up. My throat went dry. My voice cracked as I asked if there was a bathroom. He waved a hand toward the side door, still glued to his screen. I walked quickly, almost tripping over myself as I pushed inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The bathroom was small, the light buzzing above me, the walls lined with cracked tiles. I pressed my ear against the door and held my breath. For a long moment, nothing. Then I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate crunching across the gravel outside. They circled the building, slow and measured, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I pressed my back against the wall, my chest rising and falling too fast, sweat prickling across my skin despite the cold. The footsteps stopped. Then came the sound of knuckles rapping lightly against the bathroom door. Just 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. My whole body locked up. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stood there paralyzed as the silence stretched on. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. The buzzing of the light above me was the only sound left. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to unlock the door. My hand shook so hard the latch rattled. I pulled it open and stepped out into the night air. The lot was empty. My car sat alone under the flickering lights. The old pickup was gone. I almost laughed in relief, almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it, On the driver's side window of my car, smeared across the glass in the faint glow of the overhead light, was a single handprint. Long, thin fingers, pressed hard enough to streak. As if someone had been leaning close, looking in.